In the spring of 1847, a locomotive sat idle on a siding outside Ghent, surrounded by government officials, 3 engineers, and a Belgian railway inspector who refused to go anywhere near it. He had read the reports. He knew what had happened in Prussia, in England, in the Netherlands. He wrote in his dispatch to Brussels that same afternoon, "This machine is not a locomotive. It is a detonation waiting for permission." Within 18 months, it would be banned across 12 sovereign nations. The locomotive was called the Pressawerk, and almost no one alive today has heard of it. That erasure wasn't accidental. The story of the Pressawerk is the story of what happens when genius outruns caution, when an engineer builds something that works magnificently, right up until the moment it destroys everything around it. It is a story about ambition, about the terrifying gap between theoretical engineering and the chaos of actual operation, and about how one machine forced an entire continent to rethink what it meant for a railway to be safe. It began, as so many engineering catastrophes do, with a problem that needed solving. By the early 1840s, European railways were growing faster than anyone had predicted. Lines were pushing into mountains, across river valleys, upgrades that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. The locomotives of the era, capable, proven, reliable, were hitting their limits. They could haul freight across flat terrain without complaint, but ask them to climb a sustained gradient with a full load, and they struggled. Boiler pressures of 60, 70 pounds per square inch gave you enough tractive effort for level track. But the mathematics of mountain railways demanded something more. A handful of engineers across Britain and continental Europe were working independently on the same solution: push the pressure higher, compress the steam further, extract more energy from every pound of coal burned. The thermodynamics were sound. The concept was elegant. The question was whether the metallurgy of the 1840s could hold it together. Most engineers approached this problem carefully, incrementally, testing at 90, then 100, then 110 psi before proceeding further. A German engineer named Heinrich Oberfeld approached it differently. Oberfeld was not reckless. His notebooks, which survive in the Bundesarchiv in Koblenz, reveal a meticulous, almost obsessive thinker. He had spent 7 years working on boiler design, had corresponded with George Stephenson, had studied the atmospheric railway experiments in Ireland. He understood steam better than almost anyone in Europe. What he perhaps did not fully understand was the compound effect of manufacturing inconsistency, operator error, and sustained vibration on metals under extreme stress. His design, finalized in 1845, pushed boiler pressure to 165 pounds per square inch, more than double what most contemporary locomotives operated. To manage this, he engineered a thicker boiler shell, a series of internal baffles he believed would distribute stress more evenly, and a pressure relief valve system that he calculated could vent excess steam before catastrophic failure occurred. The Pressawerk was built in a small workshop outside Düsseldorf in the winter of 1845 to 1846. It was, by any aesthetic measure, an extraordinary machine. Heavier than most locomotives of its class, lower slung, with a boiler that looked almost swollen compared to its contemporaries. Observers who saw it described feeling vaguely uneasy without being able to articulate why. One railway correspondent wrote that it looked as though it was holding its breath. Initial trials, conducted on a private stretch of track in the spring of 1846, were spectacular. The pressure work hauled loads that would have stopped any other locomotive of its era. On a test gradient of 1 in 40, steep by the standards of the day, it maintained speed with a load of 380 tons. The numbers were extraordinary. Word spread quickly through the small, interconnected world of European railway engineering. Orders came in 3 from Prussian railway companies, 2 from the Netherlands, 1 from a Belgian operator planning a new mountain route. Oberfeld's workshop scrambled to produce them, and here, perhaps, was the first moment where something went wrong, not dramatically, not catastrophically, but quietly, in the tolerances. Workshop production under pressure is not the same as workshop production under careful supervision. The baffles in some units were seated slightly differently. The boiler shells, sourced from a second supplier to meet demand, had marginally thinner walls in certain sections. The pressure relief valves, produced in small batches, had variations in spring tension that inspection at the time could not detect. None of these deviations were dramatic. Each one, individually, was within what the engineers of the era considered acceptable margin. Together, they were a catastrophe assembled in pieces. The first explosion occurred in October 1846, outside Aachen. No passengers were aboard. It was a freight working. But the fireman died, and the driver lost both legs below the knee. The boiler did not simply rupture, it detonated. Observers a quarter-mile away reported hearing it clearly. A piece of boilerplate was found embedded in a farmhouse wall 200 meters from the track. Investigations were inconclusive, as investigations in 1846 tended to be. The surviving locomotive was examined, found to be superficially intact, and returned to service after 3 weeks. The second explosion occurred in January 1847 in the Netherlands near Utrecht. This time, a passenger train. 4 dead, 9 injured. And the Dutch government suspended operation of all pressure-work-type locomotives within 48 hours. Now the reports began to accumulate. Not all explosions, that is important to understand. The majority of pressure-work locomotives in service were operating without incident, but the minority that failed catastrophically and without warning. No gradual deterioration, no visible cracking, no time to react. Operators described full pressure one moment, annihilation the next. The physics, understood now though not fully grasped then, was straightforward. Oberfeld's pressure relief valves required a precise combination of spring tension and valve seat geometry to function correctly. Units where manufacturing variation pushed these outside a narrow band did not vent properly. Pressure built silently past the design threshold. When the boiler shell gave way, and with sustained vibration and thermal cycling, it eventually would, the stored energy released instantaneously. It was not a steam leak, it was a bomb. By the spring of 1847, the mathematics of political reality had overtaken the mathematics of engineering. Belgium banned the Pressurewerk type in April. Prussia followed in June. France, which had never purchased the design, banned its import and transit in August. A largely symbolic act, but one that signaled which way sentiment was running. By the end of 1848, 12 nations had issued formal prohibitions. Oberfeld's masterwork, the locomotive that could climb where nothing else could climb, was illegal from Edinburgh to the outskirts of Vienna. Oberfeld himself spent the remaining 15 years of his life attempting to redesign the system. His later notebooks show increasingly sophisticated understanding of the manufacturing inconsistency problem. He proposed what would now be recognized as a form of statistical quality control, systematic measurement across production batches, rejection criteria, traceability of materials. For 1850, this was genuinely advanced thinking. None of it was adopted. No railway company wanted the Pressure name near their operations. The brand was poisoned. Engineers who had praised the design publicly in 1846 declined to associate themselves with it by 1848. The institutional memory that formed around the Pressewerk was not a technical memory, not an analysis of what had gone wrong and how to fix it, but a social memory. This machine kills. Stay away. And so, the high-pressure approach was abandoned across Europe for nearly 3 decades. Here is the part that complicates the simple story of a dangerous machine rightfully banned. When high-pressure boiler technology returned to European locomotives in the 1870s and 1880s, it did so with better metallurgy, better quality control, better pressure relief engineering, and it transformed railway performance. The mountain lines that the 1840s operators had dreamed of became reality. Locomotives running at 180, 200 psi. I hauled trains over the Alps, through the Pyrenees, across terrain that the 60 psi engines of Oberfeld's era could never have managed. The engineering principle was not wrong. The execution was catastrophically, fatally premature. What the Pressewerk proved was not that high-pressure steam was too dangerous for railways. What it proved was that an engineering advance is only as good as the manufacturing system capable of producing it consistently and the operational system capable of managing it safely. Oberfeld understood the theory. He could not control the variation. And in 1846, with the inspection tools available, with the metallurgical standards available, with the workshop practices available, nobody could. The 12 bans were not irrational. In context, they were the correct response to an uncontrollable risk. But they also froze development for a generation. Every year that high-pressure development stalled was a year that mountain railways remained unbuilt, that passengers traveled slower, that freight moved less efficiently. The cost of the bans was real, even if the bans were right. Heinrich Oberfeld died in 1862, largely forgotten, and his name associated in railway engineering circles with failure and catastrophe. The notebooks survived because a nephew donated them to a Koblenz archive in 1891. They sat uncatalogued for 40 years. A German railway historian named Franz Bauer examined them in the 1930s and wrote a monograph, published in a small circulation journal, never translated, arguing that Oberfeld deserved recognition as a genuine pioneer of high-pressure steam rather than simply a cautionary tale. Nobody much listened. The Pressewerk itself left almost no physical trace. Of the 14 locomotives built, all were either destroyed in explosions, scrapped under government order, or cannibalized for parts. No complete example survives. There are 3 photographs, all of questionable authenticity. The machine that was banned across 12 nations, that killed at least 19 people across documented incidents, that might, in a different manufacturing environment, with different quality controls, have accelerated European railway development by 30 years. exists now only in archives that almost no one visits. Perhaps that is appropriate. Perhaps some machines should remain in the records rather than on pedestals. Or perhaps the question is more uncomfortable than that. How many advances that seemed too dangerous were simply too early? How many pressure works sit in archives, waiting for a moment that came decades too late for the person who first imagined them? The Belgian inspector who refused to approach the locomotive in 1847 was not wrong to be afraid. But somewhere in the distance between his caution and Heinrich Oberfeld's ambition is where railways, and perhaps all engineering, actually live.